Salve. Welcome to TF, your new TF. It's the free one for this week.
Yeah, it is the free one.
That's right. I beat you to it.
You did.
So how are you doing, Centurion? I might ask. How come you're talking about so much Roman stuff, Riley? It's because we are joined by probably the most frequent repeat guest we have now had, as more unprecedented things keep happening that we want to compare to similarly unprecedented things in history, making them precedented just by a very long while. It's Patrick Wyman from Tides of History. Patrick, how's it going?
I'm doing fantastic. You know, this talk about me being your most frequent guest, I think that podcasts need to do something for their most frequent guests, like a mug or maybe like a wrestling championship belt that you have to give up when you're passed.
My knowledge of historical precedents indicates that you're trying to establish yourself as a kind of like janissary class within the podcast.
Yes.
Once you give yourself certain privileges, you know, they
That's
just
correct.
become entrenched. And we have like a sort of a fifth generation Wyman who has very little to do with like the study of history, but is entitled to a mug, you know, from birth.
Exactly.
I've got some good connects in like the Northwest Kent local wrestling scene. So like,
Oh, okay.
Sorry, perfectly Hussein sentence of all time there.
Okay.
so one of the fun facts about like it's like sort of Gravesend,
Randy
Dartford, all these
Orpington,
places,
how about that?
Orpington as well, is that like there is actually like a very thriving local wrestling scene there. And a lot of like the good British local wrestlers who want to make it big in like America, they train in those places. So actually like just across like the road from my old school is a center, or like it's sort of like it's an event space, but it's like where a lot of local wrestling used to take place. And I only found out via an Australian friend of ours that like England is like a really big place to do local wrestling, and in particular Gillingham, or like not Gillingham, Gravesend, sorry.
Yeah. And so do you have access to belts
Probably
through these people?
Yeah. So Patrick, you should come down to Gravesend. We'll go have an ice cream and we'll go watch some local wrestling.
I like the idea of Patrick being a janissary, as though what we've actually done is this podcast has gone to like the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And then like we went into the town that you're from, and you were offered up as a baby to be a frequent podcast guest. You were converted
Yeah, we
to
made
podcaster.
you become Muslim as well.
Yeah. As a kind of podcast Dev Shirma, where now he's living at the palace and he doesn't actually remember his Christian upbringing.
Okay, so this is hilarious because where I grew up, Yakima, could very easily be described as the Albania of the Pacific Northwest. That is entirely appropriate. I'm just like the village headman is desperately trying to get ahead in the world and like offers his child up to go be part of the Dev Shirma.
Yeah.
Like that's
A lot of bunkers in Yakima.
I mean, honestly, that is a lot of tower houses. We still revere Skanderbeg. Like there's, all of this is
Big map of Yakima with autochthonous over the top.
Exactly. Yeah. No, we are the descendants of the Illyrians.
Dua Lipa cannot be allowed to find out about this.
It's a new kind of Mormonism that says that there was a lost tribe of Albanians who escaped the Ottoman Empire and then settled the Pacific Northwest. I'm starting a hot new religion.
Two depleted uranium plates that you received from God.
Yeah, this is this is less ridiculous than a lot of what you would actually see in the place where I grew up. Like, this is not at all. I would say this fits in pretty neatly with the milieu in which I grew up. Like, because it really basically is upper middle class parents desperately trying to like offer up their children to any sort of institution outside Central Washington that will take them. Like, that's basically it.
Here's the funny thing, though, right? We made a reference to janissaries early on, and we're going to talk
so often the way.
And we're going to and oddly, janissaries are mentioned throughout because what we are talking about is today the quest among a certain strand of right-winger to confront the failures of the global sort of North Atlantic Empire to respond to their concerns, referring to a kind of janissary class of like journalists and academics, right? But more specifically, less about the janissaries, let's go a little further back in time, a little bit further west, who are calling for an American Caesar. And this is largely inspired by like the closest the American Caesar people have ever gotten to anything that looks like a whiff of institutional power is the post-January 6th Republican Party that stuck with Trump, and also the kind of strain of like sort of specifically tech-inflected fascism that we sort of hinted at when we sort of talked about J.D. Vance. So you might call loosely like Tealism, Yarvinism, the Balaji network state people, all of these.
The immortal science of Tealism, Yarvinism.
Yeah, essentially.
That's right.
And there is now this coherent strand with a political actor who, as ridiculous as he may be, and off-putting as he may be, the most unpopular vice presidential choice in recent memory, and weirdly, Donald Trump Jr.'s guy. Like they let Don Jr. make one decision, and it was J.D. Vance.
Just like, I'm going to win my dad back. He's finally going to show affection to me for the first time in my life.
Well, it stands for Junior Don Vance.
Yeah.
I have picked this couch fucking to be his vice presidential nominee. This will make him love me, because if there's two things I know about my father, Donald Trump, it's that he's and it's that he's a
Don Jr. is like, I need to pick the only bigger pussy than me to make my dad like me. But there is nevertheless, right? All the people aside, this is, I would say, the most this tendency has ever looked like it might make a real go at something. And I think it's worth talking about with the parallels of like historical Caesar. What do we mean when we talk about the desire for an American Caesar, basically?
Okay, so one thing I want to get out of the way right at the start. Just how fucking weird these beliefs are. And I like that you said that they're coherent, because they are coherent. I really think that I really think that there are coherent strands of political thought that are running through this that work as a kind of complete ideological approach to how they want the United States to work. I think that there's actually a coherence there, which has not always been the case in kind of American right-wing political thought. But that it is so far beyond even the terminology that most Americans think about governance in, that like if they are exposed to it, I think it will really freak them out.
Well, because it is, I mean, what the story of right-wing politics that we've been talking about on this show for a very long time. And when I say right-wing politics, I don't mean like the general sort of rightward drift of everybody, but the people who self-identify as right-wing in both America and the state and the UK, right, has been one of getting weirder and more alienating as the space of as their space among normies gets taken up by a kind of liberal mass that then refuses to do anything and then creates appeal among the weirder fringe people, right? But this is a march so far to the fringe, right, that it is at once I think it's alarming in its, as you say, like, because it's a coherent fringe position and like people will vote for it, but it cannot be emphasized enough how much it is championed by boobs and weirdos, and it is genuine. It is this undercurrent of ridiculousness. And if you want to compare to like different eras of like, you know, incipient fascist takeovers, you also have to remember Mussolini, Himmler, Hitler. These were freak shows too. They were gigantic fucking dorks who were massive losers. And
yeah, fascism has the kind of historical advantage of being both tragedy and farce at the same time.
Yeah. When at least one of them was Italian too.
Yeah.
I think shouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah. The word that gets thrown around a lot when in overviews of this kind of political thought is esoteric. And I think that's a really good word for it, because it's weird. Like, these guys are into weird strands of thought. They are inculcated in spaces that are way outside the norms of mainstream American politics. Like, this basically, you know, like, one of the kind of defining things when people talk about the early modern period and the rise of like a public is spaces like coffee houses or like media, like newspapers, as ways and places in which people can talk about things and debate things and kind of formulate their ideas and bounce them off each other. Like, so we have all of these, like, and that's continued. That's the public sphere, right? This is Habermas, right? So this continues up into the present day where we have all these different spaces, but the spaces in which these ideas are coming to the fore are super isolated. They have their own little rules and ways of talking about things that are not broadly shared among any sort of public. This is a very specific group of people, and there's not a lot of overlap, I would say, between them and the kind of broader political world. Like, they are coming at this from a very different set of assumptions, very strange set of assumptions.
Are you suggesting that most people don't get their political news from the fappening subreddit?
That's
I think they're on weirder stuff, but also the other thing I think you bring up, right?
The fappening is quite centrist. Actually.
Yeah, it's centrist for them, but everyone's too old. But right, I think the other thing I think you mentioned I think is worth bringing up before we dive into like what they've said, what they've demanded, and start talking about like, well, these are their demands for a Caesar. This is what they want their Caesar to do. What did Romans want? What did historical Caesar do? Right? What conditions gave rise to him? I think it's worth like pulling up also what you mentioned about newspapers, right? Is that these places also aren't neutral places where public opinion gets formed. It's also a place where what is allowed to be public opinion is formed. And I think what we have seen on, again, the self-identified right in the UK and the US for the last few years is a kind of a realization that partly due to the success of their own economic project, they had to sort of burn off a lot of the people in their projects who are acceptable to the people who form public opinion, generally speaking, right? You had to basically get into like in the case of like Britain, right? You remember like all of the before this as the Brexit negotiations were happening, the Tories like just unilaterally got rid of like 30 of their MPs who were causing problems because you're now too like regular for us. We are changing what is possible to talk about in this public sphere, which means we have to build opinion from outside of it and yank the newspaper or the coffee shop or the bazaar or whatever over. And that also happens where it's like all of a sudden January 6th, it's like, okay, hang Mike Pence. That's what we got to do, right? It's because that guy
he was sort of acceptable mainstream Republican position now because of like institutional capture.
Yeah, that guy's got to get burned off. And so what we're talking about is like we're talking with those sort of places where public opinion gets formed. They were sort of driven out, and now they're back to try to wrest the public opinion back, right? I think that what we're seeing is just these people are fucking freak shows, but that's their goal, right? So I'm going to read a little bit about what like J.D. Vance and co. and his like friends have said, the origins of American Caesarism as a kind of political idea. We're going to see like what it's like, what people believe who believe it, and then we're going to talk a little bit about history. So the most direct statement about like what this means comes from an interview with Vance himself in Vanity Fair. We're in a late Republican period, Vance said. If we're going to push back against it, we're going to have to get pretty wild and pretty far out there and go in directions that a lot of conservatives right now are pretty uncomfortable with. Indeed, said another person talking here, among my circle, the phrase extra-constitutional had come up quite a bit. So what is sort of implied here, I think, is that American Caesarism is about like do away with the late Republic. So I'll ask now, right? What is a late Republican period for like Rome look like?
Okay, so I think it's important to distinguish between what a late Republican period looked like for Rome and what these people understand by the idea of a late Republic to do the comparison, right? Like this, because it's not like they have in their heads a coherent picture of the late Roman Republic and they're using that as their inspiration. It's that they have a clear picture of what they think is wrong with present day America, and this is the historical parallel on which they've hit.
Yeah.
Right. So there's I think that what they understand by that is a time in which the time-honored channels through which people like them get to wield power have been increasingly shut off, and that this is a bad state of affairs, and that we need to remake the state in order to unquestionably leave the right people in positions of power and authority. Mm-hmm. And that what is necessary to do that is somebody who is willing and able to wield power in any way necessary. Mm. Like that what all of these people, and I know we're going to get into this later, kind of the differences between the people who kind of generally espouse this viewpoint, and there are differences, but what they all share in common is the foundational belief that you have to wield power. And for them, Caesar as the kind of capstone to the late Republican or to the late Roman Republic is seen by them as the person who is willing to wield power. But this speaks to the esoteric nature here. Like, I don't think Caesar is actually what they want. They like the idea of a Caesar, but the figure that they're actually obsessed with is Sulla.
Yeah. Yes.
And so but you can't just go around talking about Sulla because nobody knows who the fuck Sulla is. So even among this like incredibly esoteric community, but what they really want is a reactionary figure who is going to use power to set in place an order that is acceptable to them and that gives them the ability to wield power, right? So an overarching powerful figure who will create space in which this group of people who feel that they don't wield enough power get to do more, and that society will be better because of that. That's the basic viewpoint.
Well, Sulla had to deal with the Grackite because they went woke.
I mean, that kind of is...
They went woke.
That is sort of the point of view, though, right? Is that while the plebs have their tribunician power, and now they're the Julii, everyone went woke, and now good, honest Julii have to abide by Roman DEI or whatever. Or that wouldn't be a number.
Yeah, they're admitting ghouls into the Senate.
Yeah. We got
because it woke.
Yeah, that's right.
And I guess Sulla was like the first.
We're gonna have a total ban on ghouls. Till we figure out what's happening.
Yeah, but I think
calling any of the Spanish emperors DEI hires.
Never mind the Thracians, man.
Yeah.
Like that's the.
I love that year of the 4 emperors just being like, DEI. Vespasian wasn't good Italian stock.
This is the kind of shit that they would be into, though.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's this
exactly...
weird, aristocratic turn that they've taken. They've kind of, if you remember a few years ago, people like Tom Cotton were trying to weld together. Vance even still tries it sometimes, but not with as much conviction. The whole real labor, real working class stuff is engaged in, is a right-wing project. It belongs to us and is fundamentally it's interested in the same things that we're doing. It should be racist too. Right. But now all of these guys are deeply into thinking about which Roman aristocrat they're most like, at least amongst themselves. And I think that's an interesting turn, right?
They pass around memes of Sulla. These are statue guys. These are Roman bust guys. That's who they are.
So just let's take it back, right? For listeners who don't know, can you tell us who Sulla is and what context he emerged from, and according to people like him and people who supported him, what problems was he solving?
Okay, so Sulla is the winner of Rome's first great civil war. The Roman civil wars with which we are most familiar in the general public are those at the very end of the Republic that involve Caesar, Pompey, and then Brutus, basically which end with Caesar winning, then Caesar getting assassinated, and then his adopted son, Octavian, ending the Roman Republic and founding what we understand as the Roman Empire. This is the very broad strokes. There's a lot of debatable stuff in there, but that's the broad strokes. Before that, a generation before that, there was an equally violent civil war that started with Caesar's uncle, a guy named Marius, and his eventual opponent in this becomes a guy named Sulla. Sulla eventually wins the civil war, goes to Rome, sets himself up as dictator, has executed a whole bunch of people that he finds unacceptable, puts in place what he presents as a restoration of the constitutional order, but which is in reality a deeply reactionary and conservative reimagining of Rome's political institutions. He does things like change the number of magistrates, puts a strict hierarchy on the magistracies, says that if you've been a tribune, that's the only political office that you're going to hold, which means that that's shut off as an avenue to political advancement.
Which is super important because that civil war between Marius and Sulla was sort of growing off the back of entrenched problems of legalized inequality between patricians and plebs in Rome, right? Yeah, exactly. Also, you could call it Project 25 BC.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I've been working on quite a bit recently because I've been working on the early Roman Republic. And when you work on the early Roman Republic, you get into all sorts of debates about what the Roman Republic actually is and how you should understand it. And the viewpoint that I find most compelling on this is from a historian named Harriet Flower, who wrote a book called Roman Republics. And her argument basically is that there is no Roman Republic. There is a succession of quite drastically different political orders that we tend to lump under the heading of the Roman Republic. And so there's, at the very beginning, there's basically chaos. Nobody knows what this is. Then there is a kind of a proto-republic where you see some of the names of the magistracies that you become familiar with, like the consulship. Then there's a patrician republic that lasts for about a century that's dominated by the patricians. Then there is, and this is the longest stage, what's called a Republic of the Nobiles. So this is what we think of as the classical Roman Republic with a Senate, magistracies whose names you recognize. So there's consuls and praetors and people like this. This is the period of Rome's greatest expansion. This carries them through the Punic Wars, the expansion of the 2nd century BC. So to the point where Rome has become a trans-Mediterranean empire, right? This is the Republic of the Nobiles.
Oh, because of woke.
Yeah, that's right.
Because of woke.
You should have seen their flag.
Yeah. But so what happens is this lasts for about 200 years, from about 367 BC. This is supposed to be the end of the conflict of the orders, until 133 BC, when the Gracchi start making trouble. But basically, the idea is that after 133 BC, you get a succession of short-lived attempts to codify and institutionalize an essentially amorphous constitutional order. That the Republic lasted, this Republic of the Nobiles worked for about 2 centuries with more or less unwritten rules about how things were supposed to function.
Oh, it's like Britain.
Yeah, that honestly, yeah, that it functioned because people understood how it was supposed to function, and that they obeyed these kind of unwritten and unspoken rules about what the acceptable bounds of behavior were. Then the Gracchi come in, and they start agitating for all sorts of good things for the little people, and it all went to shit.
I'm so tired of toxic Gracchi bros posting in that forum.
Yeah, well, they're sort of going around telling people that they're not allowed to like have a drink in their bin and like, other stuff because of work.
The magic grain twins.
Sorry, magic grain twins.
They're going to take away your Diet Mountain Dew. And they're like, it's just like...
Yeah. Would the Gracchi be prepared to fire a ballista at our enemies? No, that's what they won't answer the question. Would they be prepared to fire a ballista through 10 Germans to save one child?
Yeah,
that's the Roman trolley problem.
Would you nationalize dormice?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, Jesus.
They're going to make Garum communist.
Yeah. Problem is, the Gracchi, he sympathises with the defenders of Masada.
What you think now? You got all these teens, they're loitering around the taverna, they're all drinking wine. It wouldn't have happened under Sulla. They'd have all been thrown off the Tarpeian Rock.
You can genuinely find so many sources of people saying this shit would never have happened under Sulla, right?
Yeah.
Which is so funny.
My dad used to throw us off the Tarpeian Rock every night, taught us a lesson.
This is impossibly accurate. Yeah. Like, this is...
Roman's number one favorite activity is to bitch and moan about the current state of Rome and be like, it wasn't like this back in the day when we had manly virtues.
Yeah.
And this is the, like, when you try to draw parallels between the Roman world and the present day, that particular vibe is the greatest parallel that you can draw. The tendency among old, powerful dudes of a certain stripe to lament that they are no longer as powerful and young as they once were, and that the new folks just don't understand how good things used to be, and that we need to go back to the way things used to be if we want them to be good again. That is the fundamental impulse of kind of Roman aristocracy, and that is the single greatest lesson that modern people have drawn from the Roman world. Things used to be better, and we can make them better if we go back.
Yeah, it's I think the kind of American or Anglo-American really version of the rituals used to be properly observed in this city is essentially a sort of canard to like, civil rights went too far. right? Which is we used to, it wouldn't be like, oh, we used to observe our rituals properly. It's people knew their place.
Yeah.
Right. And so much of, and I mean, this, when you talk about, like, I went back in time to like find, you know, because this is, I'd say 2018 is when you first start getting calls for the American Caesar, right? Because it is in both the UK and the US. I think the sort of the right-wing project takes on it's anti-institutionalism, reaches the tipping point. And then by 2018, you start to see people.
You have them say shit like disband the FBI, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Again, and this is something, November, you've brought up again and again, right? Which is that exists to help them.
Yes.
But they cannot stand that because it has to appear to be egalitarian, right? Like the civil service exists, like how much of the civil service, for example, right? This to take it to a British example, exists to like brutalize immigrants, brutalize like people like collecting benefits. How much of it exists to advance their political goals? But because they also have like a rainbow lanyard, they're like disband the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm playing with a deck stacked for me.
He's abusing asylum seekers in a gay sort of way, so I don't like it.
Yeah. I have this deck stacked for me, but because it appears fair occasionally, I wish to burn it, basically. Right? And so back in America, right, you get this tendency from 2018, and specifically it's from 2018. It's from Michael Anton, a former Trump speechwriter and Giuliani staffer. Hilarious.
Speechwriters?
Wow, he's writing that source?
I mean, I'd say someone who wrote for Trump and then Trump, I'm going to ignore it.
I'm going to do my shark bit. He doesn't want me to do my shark bit. Should I do it?
Mr. President, what I'm thinking is you should say Hannibal Lecter, really great guy. We all know Hannibal Lecter. We know him. We love him. He's on that trolley. Beautiful
the thing
guy.
Is, what happened is Trump got Sulla and Hannibal Lecter confused.
Sorry, I said speechwriter for Trump. Sorry, he was.
He ate the crack guy with a nice Chianti.
He did strategic communications for Trump, which is the best you can do. He's a speechwriter for Giuliani. But he was the first one,
even better,
who talks about American Caesar. And he also refers to like the cathedral pretty much overtly. He says, the quest for black civil rights morphed into demands for special rights and privileges for everyone but heterosexual white men. The poisonous fruits of which change have rolled over America the past few months. This is justified as corrective, but the gap between the supposedly privileged and the supposedly subordinated doesn't change. So this woke left ascendancy is managerial leftist libertarianism, in effect creating a nationwide oligarchic system devoted to implementing left-wing policies without the consent of the governed, for whom contempt mixed with hatred are the only emotions of the ruling classes. We get critarchy, corruption, electoral manipulation, weaponized quote-unquote justice.
They all fucking talk like this, man. Like, just be, like, getting so racist that you start talking like fucking Sephiroth.
Yeah. Also, it's critarchy. It's a term that if you read these guys' writing, which unfortunately I have, comes up again and again and again and again, which and critarchy is I had to look this up. I didn't know what it means. It refers to a system of rule by biblical judges in ancient Israel, which is about like the woke DEI people, basically. And these,
if you're not gay enough, they turn you into a pillar of salt.
Well,
yeah, I'm in the like trans Sanhedrin or whatever to these guys.
And what comes up again, right, is that there is deep in every American institution or Anglo-American institution, if we extend it that way, there is an egalitarian conspiracy of career bureaucrats.
You can get this from Liz Truss, for instance, too.
Yeah, this is basically Liz Truss, but Liz Truss is sort of just saying it quite directly. Whereas these people have to dress it up in like quite, florid language because again, they are also all pretending to be like, Lord Byron or at that least writing like the Federalist Papers.
Liz Truss spending £10,000 of civil service money on togas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Soiled togas.
Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile to take a step back and think about kind of the basic animating assumptions here, which and the ways in which those do and don't align with kind of the broader. Because I don't think there's any question that like there are conservative impulses buried in a lot of segments of American society, right? Like that there are a lot of working class white people in the United States who are extremely culturally conservative. I think that's a fair thing to say. Those impulses are all over the place. And the extent to which those impulses overlap with the animating assumptions of this project is something I think you got to figure out. But like the basic thing here is that this is a hierarchical way of understanding the world and how politics work. And that's why they think there's a cadre of woke bureaucrats who are making decisions about this, because they can't conceptualize a world in which somebody is not in charge and making decisions for other people, right? Like they are reading this model onto the world because it's how they think the world A works and B should work, that some people are better than others, and the people who are better than others should be making decisions for the people who aren't. And so they think that there is a conspiracy to keep them down because they can't conceptualize a world in which like the bureaucrats aren't there to wield power and make you understand your place. Like they think that's how the world works, and so that's the viewpoint that they take. Now, I think belief in hierarchy and that's the most fundamental dividing line in American politics. At the basic subconscious level is people vote one way because they think the world's hierarchical, and they vote the other way because they don't. Like I think that the most basic impulses in American politics right now are between hierarchical thinking and non-hierarchical thinking. And to the extent that this project has any appeal whatsoever, it plays on that, right? It speaks to that idea that some people are better than others, and some people ought to be in charge and other people shouldn't be. Like some people should know their place. Like if you ask the American electorate that question, do you have a place and should people know what their place is? You're going to get an enormous correlation with voting patterns and increasing, because I think these assumptions are becoming more explicit.
To take that back to the question of a Caesar, this project then says everyone should be, and this is one of the reasons I think it's also interesting to have this conversation, right? Because whether you're talking about Caesar or Sulla, you're talking about people who like went on to fundamentally remake the state, right? And to solve lots of issues. But I wonder, were the ancient Romans who would have supported Sulla, mostly Sulla, because we're mostly actually talking about Sulla rather than Caesar, would they have understood their problems as real problems? Because the thing that really strikes me about this, right, because there's another quote from Roger. We're not Rodologists. We don't talk about Rod Dreher that much, but he's talking directly about our subject here, right? Where he talks about, well, who are they that American Caesar is supposed to oppose? Not a conspiracy. They don't have to be a conspiracy. The American ruling class, which is what American neo-reactionary thinker Curtis Yarvin, we'll talk about later, calls the cathedral. They run the institutions, even the woke military, which fewer and fewer normal young men want to join now. They're not even hanging out with me, Rod.
I can't join the armed forces. They're being gay in there. This would never have been allowed before.
They're especially not in the classical world.
No.
They're mostly on the left, but not entirely. After all, it wasn't a democratic president who invaded Iraq and wasted blood and treasure, tried to build liberal democracy in Afghanistan. That America operated as an empire under the form of liberal democracy only goes to show that history, unlike God, writes crooked with straight lines. It's the decline of empire that may coincide with the advent of strongman government. The young man who tried to kill Trump might have thought he was trying to save America from Caesar. He wasn't. It was entirely possible that in doing so and failing, he's delivered the country into the hands of one. And the revolting behavior of the American ruling class in the woke janissaries.
I can tell exactly the week-long period in which this was written, in which everybody thought that the Trump assassination attempt wouldn't be meaningful.
Yeah, who spent the past 40 years marching through the institutions will have inclined us towards welcoming him. And that's, I think, the most revealing paragraph, which is, the woke janissaries have spent 40 years marching through the American institutions. There is a conspiracy we must crush. That's an imaginary conspiracy, right? As much as it's a conspiracy, it's just culture has changed and the types of people who get those jobs are different from you and your friends and your tech buddies and so on.
No, that doesn't sound plausible. It has to be like George Soros or whatever.
You can't be a normal janitor these days. You have to be woke.
When you want a revolutionary government to tackle an imaginary enemy, how does that compare to, say, Sulla's revolutionary government of Rome?
Okay, so I'll say this. The first thing is, if we want to try to understand late Republican Rome, the part where we have the most trouble grasping it is that I think the vibes are hard for us to recover. Like when we're having these discussions, what you're describing basically is a vibe, right? Like there is a vibe in which these people think that they're being oppressed, and it's mostly unspoken. Like it's animating their stuff, but they feel like they have to dress it up in ideological justification. And recovering the equivalent vibe for late Republican Rome, I think, is quite difficult. Like it's hard for us to know what people were saying to each other and how those ideas were animating their actions. But I think fairly clearly the distinction is that the late Roman conflict was an elite one. It was an armed conflict for power and control of the state and resources among people who had a lot in common and were related to one another. Like basically by conquering the trans-Mediterranean world, this very small group of Roman elite families became impossibly wealthy and powerful, and they got into a lot of disagreements about how to properly divide the spoils of that. And it's this incredibly competitive elite environment. And this is where there is not a parallel with the United States.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is an entirely different kind of package. I think we have made the late Republic much more ideological than it actually was. I think there was basically a conflict between different elite groups, and Sulla's like remaking of the Constitution was because he was a weird little freak who wanted things to be organized. Like Sulla got into some very strange sexual stuff, and that was really what he wanted to do. But before he went off to do that, and end his life in what contemporaries thought was kind of idleness, dissolution, and sin, he wanted to remake the constitutional order to fit how he thought it was supposed to work. And I don't think it was overly ideological. I think it was just that he was an organized thinker and he wanted things to be organized, and this was his understanding of how it would best be organized. Like it wasn't
he was the first cracked 10x autist, basically. But
there's a good case for Sulla as autist.
Yeah,
yes,
that's one of the points I wanted to draw out by talking about how they talk about it, which is they are drawing on they are trying to use by like force of arms in the state win a cultural victory by evoking a previous sort of set of circumstances, and in fact evoking many of the tropes that they used in the previous set of circumstances, which were also cultural, but to win a material victory. The goals of an American Caesar project, like Project 2025, many of the economic goals were like achieved in the first Trump term. Right? They in fact, much of what like J.D. Vance wants to do is like, devalue the dollar, which is, that's a lot of that's the Inflation Reduction Act, but without like the woke green energy stuff. Right? And it seems that many of their obsessions appear to be that there are too many DEI departments in universities, that minority rights have come up too far, and that they've created an enemy, the cathedral, that is at once everywhere. And we know what happens.
Well, it was supposed to be in Twitter, but it moved before Elon Musk could rip it out of the walls, right?
We know what happens when you finally beat the cathedral. You gain entry. Is you end up tearing down the cathedral looking for it.
There are cathedrals everywhere for those with meth to smoke.
Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile to focus on the material aspects, because like you think about who's funding this and who's really deeply invested in it, and it's guys like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk now increasingly, though I think he's probably...
He pulled his money out from under Trump, though, because he's Mr. Never Gonna Follow Through.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a fucking clown, and I feel like the people who actually operate in that space understand that he's a clown, whereas Thiel is deadly serious. Like, he is a weirdo, but he is deadly serious.
He's being serious about the boy blood.
Yeah, I was going to say, anyone who's using that much virgin blood is definitely plugged into Roman politics, if you can say anything.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, but like, I think you look at the companies that Thiel owns, and he wants to build a new national security state that is intimately intertwined with his private enterprises, right? And to the extent Elon Musk has been a successful businessman, it's been through what amount to public-private partnerships. And like SpaceX, I think, is best understood as a public-private partnership. Right? Like that's what it does. Like these guys have gotten rich off of government contracts, and they may have convinced themselves that they didn't, but they, like, I think on some basic level, they understand where their bread is buttered, and they see their best chance to continuing to be wealthy and powerful and to enrich this other class of investors in Silicon Valley who do tech shit and are ideologically aligned with them. It's that they want a piece of that pie too. Like this is the most classically fascist thing about it, is that it's corporatist.
Yeah.
It's a way of understanding how the state should function that sees a fundamental role for the enrichment of the right kind of private business.
So if in effect, really, they're not hearkening back to Rome, they're hearkening back to Germany, which harkened back to Rome.
You know, these guys were more honest when they said they wanted an American Pinochet, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, they want to do IG Farben and Messerschmitt, and like that's what they want, is like companies that are being generously subsidized by the state to perform national security functions, or what are understood to be national security functions. The difference is in the 30s, that was military, and that was military mass production. And here it's control of the electronic infrastructure. I mean, like electronic infrastructure, I sound like fucking Luddite, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's both. I mean, there's a reason why they're so upset by the idea of like, the Lockheed Martin like pride socks or whatever.
Yeah.
I think we could see the Silicon Valley obsession with creating electric VTOL taxis as a desire to recreate American Pinochet in the aggregate.
Yeah. You can't pronounce VTOL without V2, all right?
That's right. A lot of people are going to be thrown clear of flying vehicles at some point.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic reference.
Thank you.
Like so many sort of political projects, Red Caesarism, whatever you want to call it, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Balaji, all of this group of people, this sort of Eric Schmidt even, like the radicalizing right-wing tech people who all loved Curtis Yarvin. There's not so much, they're not saying, yes, we literally want a king. It's rather we're saying we see the remnants of the administrative state as standing in the way. We have made a huge amount of profit. The easiest way for us to make more profit is for us to have a much greater direct role in running the administrative state. And to do that, the administrative state has to be got rid of. And then going back to like the transformation of like the Conservative Party and the Republican Party from its like party of mass appeal to businessmen and fascists and also, others, to like, we burned off all the normal people who like the administrative state, right? The quote unquote normal people. We're now like the party of groypers who like are bound together by our ideological love of something completely fucking weird. Because what we actually want, right, is completely fucking weird to everybody who everybody who's like looking at it, but crucially is less weird than there being a king. A more direct role for Peter Thiel in government is what they're likely to achieve if they get elected and can surpass like the fact that they've chosen the couch fucking guy as like the figurehead for this project.
I mean, you never know. I never want to be too dismissive of this stuff and say, oh, well, they don't actually want what they say they want, or that they won't necessarily get what they say they want, I think nobody thought that anybody was going to, like Napoleon was going to be wearing a crown given time. So, we'll see, right? Which is the only thing you can ever say historically is we'll see. But I think you're right to kind of suggest that ultimately what they're doing here is kind of incremental, right?
American King is a fun concept.
I mean, came closer than people imagine a few times.
They already have a monarch. It's called the Burger King.
Burger King is in serious trouble right now, man. They're not the king is not doing well.
He's not doing well.
I ate at Burger King recently, and let me tell you, it's gone downhill in the last decade.
Yeah, it's because of woke.
because of woke. Because there's no respect for monarchs in this country anymore.
That's because the clowns in McDonald's keep trying to keep him down.
That's true. Yeah. So I think it's worth trying to step back for a minute and try to understand like who the audience is for this and what kind of support you can garner for it, and what parts of this appeal to different powerful groupings within American society that wield political influence. So as you guys know, I'm a big fan of the American Gentry as a fairly coherent social, political, and economic group. And I think the Gentry class likes this a lot because they have the luxury of what amount to luxury political beliefs. Like, I think there is a lot of hatred of things like DEI and the idea that their failed children might not necessarily ascend to their position. Like, I think this is a prime group of people who are well placed to receive a message that says your idiot son might not get to be just as wealthy as you because a frankly more talented person of color could get the job or get the spot in a university. Like, there's a lot of anxiety about that stuff among that class of people. And so even beyond their material benefits that they would gain from like eliminating worker protections or having to give your workers like heat breaks in the middle of a 120-degree day, like they benefit materially from that, right? I think the psychological benefit of eliminating competition for their underwhelming children and getting to wield power over their workers those are really appealing psychological things beyond the material benefits that they would accrue from them. So I think the point is the tech oligarchs can find support from a much broader group of local and regional oligarchs for their project because culturally they align.
And if you've already agreed, again, going back to like what is acceptable public opinion, right? If you've already if you can get mass support for that essentially like Gentry and up project by saying, look, we've already agreed nothing can get better for you, but we can punish the people who scare you, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that comes back to, and all we need to do to punish the people that scare you, by the way, or who are competing with your idiot sons for like, positions in your good universities. All we need to do is there's this one department in the government. It's full of people who are, whether because they're do-gooders or whether they're cynical, they are keeping us from doing what needs to be done. They're keeping
pressing the racism button.
Yeah, we want to let you make your workers work in 130-degree heat for 24 hours if they choose to, of course. We want to do that for you. We also, hey, that new family that moved in that you don't like, we want the police to harass them more. Unfortunately, the woke police who are being made woke by this other woke government department won't do it. They
Finally,
won't.
in America, the police are going to be allowed to be racist.
They don't think
At
the police.
long last.
They don't think the police are allowed to be racist.
But
they don't believe it.
To sort of sound the note of caution here that it can always get worse, right? What these people want is pretty transparent, right? Like, again, I think they were more honest about it previously. A lot of this stuff about Sulla, right? Nobody's thinking about like, oh, the Roman mob's going to come to my house and like put me to the sword and burn it down, right? But people are thinking about like, being thrown out of the Brazilian VTOL taxi or the camps, right? Not that there aren't already kind of camps and, prison industrial, et cetera, but like it can always be worse. And these people, I think, often have a fairly clear idea of how they want to make it worse that they're just not telling you.
You know what? When I also think of the Caesar where I go to the Caesar rather than the Sulla comparison is, what else I think they want is prescription. I think they want I think they want their identified enemies who are sort of paraded in front on them in front of the TV. They want them, ritually humiliated, stripped of their property, and exiled or executed. Right?
Sure.
This is that's basically
the
what
woke vigiles won't do anything about the Scythians who live on my street, causing all manner of havoc, playing the tambourine.
Once you acknowledge that, it becomes somewhat more difficult to fit it into a sort of a comedy podcast, right? This isn't quite as much of a fun historical kind of comparison anymore, right?
So ever since like living in Arizona, like I know these people now in a way that I didn't when I lived in Los Angeles. When I lived in LA, I was acquainted with the kind of ideological right-wing sphere, right? Like so the guys like I've read Michael Anton's shit and I've read Curtis Yarvin's shit. I understand it. I understand that milieu. But the flip side to it, and this is where it becomes actually dangerous, is that a lot of the animating vibes appeal very broadly to conservative American men, especially. Like to kind of culturally conservative. I would say the real sweet spot is like Gen X and young and old millennial white guys who live in the suburbs and who in states like Arizona and Georgia and Texas and like a lot of places in the United States. Like there are millions
upstate
of
New
these
York
guys.
as well.
Yeah,
right?
upstate New York, absolutely.
Not even upstate New York. They probably live in Westchester County.
Yeah, Ohio. Yeah, I mean, I think suburban Portland, like where I think it's especially attenuated around liberal cities where they can point to the green-haired trans people that they don't like and say, look, it's all going to hell. Like that it's this deeply kind of rock solid conservative middle American, but pretty economically comfortable who really who have a lot of hate in their hearts for this for a world that they don't think has a place for them and that they don't like and they think they should wield power or control over. And like I take it very seriously because when I'm coaching a soccer game and I'm surrounded by guys like this, I'm like, God, if you knew my politics, you would have no problem throwing me in a concentration camp. Like there are people that I say hi to on a regular basis who I know would be perfectly happy to put a bullet in me if they thought I was trying to turn their kids trans, right? Like, this is a real thing. Like, these people really exist. They really think like that. And I don't think it would take nearly as much as we would like to think to push them over the edge into supporting that kind of stuff.
And as like clownish and stupid, and as clearly like, who thought that like Sarah Palin would be the tragedy to JD Vance's farce? Apparently, let's see, right? But as much as that is a ridiculous person, as much as, again, like that has been exemplified by ridiculous people in the UK, like Liz Truss and so on, that's not their last go. This is just their first time they've gotten closest.
What did people say about Hitler in 1923, right? Like what were they saying about Hitler in the aftermath of the beer hall putsch?
Very bad paintings, failed out of art school, pathetic.
But this is a worthwhile thing, is like when you have what these people have, and what makes them dangerous is will to power. They have that in a really genuine and basic way. They understand that power is a thing that you can grab and wield, and that you don't have to have the support of everybody to do that, right? Like where their perspective, I think, is most valuable and enlightening for the rest of us, is that they grasp very clearly that you don't have to have the support of 80% of the population to do stuff.
And crucially, you only have to get, and this is something I think that, I think a lot about the history of Anglosphere right-wing politics through the lens of the history of the New Deal. As soon as the New Deal was announced, there was an elite conspiracy against it. This elite conspiracy was, Texas oil men, sort of Wall Street financiers, and so on. That was like the alliance, right? It was provincial and sort of financial capital together against the New Deal. There has been this slow growing fight back against this, like, pretty what's turning out to be like a quite exceptional period of time, where for certain favored groups of like working people anyway, living standards are rising and even then the civil rights movement happened in that time, and so on, right? That the reaction against the things that happened between the New Deal and the civil rights movement has been essentially to understand that power has to be taken, and when you take power, you remake the state in your image a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution, the same thing, right? You take power, and then you remake the state in your image so that even if you lose power to a Blair or a Clinton or whatever, they're forced to keep going with what you have done. And I think that the reason, again, that we go back to sort of this original topic of like, isn't it weird that they're talking about Caesar when they mean Sulla, but what they really basically mean is we want to have a final corporatist, elite-driven remake of like liberal democratic institutions in the sort of global Anglosphere in such a way that we only have to win once.
You know what? There's a sort of a useful parallel for that for. We could have saved ourselves a lot of time, right? Because the original, like, we can violate Godwin's law just up front and use as shorthand. We talked about this, you and I, Riley, on Left on Red, about ecopraxia, about how sometimes with kind of like with predators, you're better off stereotyping, right? Because it saves you time. You don't fall into these like traps of thinking, oh, are they like Caesar? Are they like Sulla? What these people want is Hitler, right? To be absolutely clear about that. That's by far the best and clearest reference that I think most people will understand and probably comes closest to the truth.
I think you're absolutely right. Because and something I've warned about, and I think a lot of historians who are not in the immediate business of selling stuff to the MSNBC crowd would agree with, is that it's easily possible to overfit your comparisons, your historical comparisons. And the most popular ones to do that with are the Roman Republic and world immediately pre-World War II. But sometimes the fucking shoe fits. Like this is like, these people, I don't think they would ever admit it out loud, but I think they look at the relationship between Hitler and big business, the relationship between Hitler and the Prussian Junkers, and they say, yeah, that's right. That's correct. That's the correct way to do it. That is a replicable model for the remaking of state structures in a way that is favorable to us, right? Like that's it. It is what he did worked because it spoke to the deeply rooted cultural and political overlap between these groups, between these disparate groups that all want the state to be different than it is and don't like things as they are. You got to find the points of overlap, and that's a viable kind of alliance of different elite groups.
Oh yeah, I think you find that coalition, right, like emerging, right, and trying to find itself amongst the like tech people who what they want out of this is that they never want to see like another homeless person, and they also want infinite money, right? To the Peter Thiels, you might have like a more sort of like esoteric articulated version of it, to the Curtis Yarvins who are like busy drawing like Babylonian demon sigils on the wall and stuff, to your like used car dealer, right? And I think that's as you say, that's the real hazard, right?
I think a good one of the like all good Patrick episodes, we sort of got we left the notes in the dirt long ago. But
sorry about
no, this is that's good. That's fine. But one of the things I wanted to come back to, right, if we want to talk about the danger of it, is to look at where they disagree, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that, okay, well, Curtis Yarvin and Chris Rufo had a big public like slap fight last year because they disagreed about what's to be done with the universities. Chris Rufo was like, oh, universities are amazing for producing elites. We need to take them over, fire all the grievance studies people, eliminate all the DEI departments. Very, very similar, by the way, to like what the just British government has been doing to universities in Britain for years, right? That then and Chris Rufo and his like, online buddies did that at a university in Florida. And Curtis Yarvin was like, what are you talking about? You're never going to dismantle the Master's Cathedral with the Master's tools, right? You're never going to, you're trying to beat apart a cathedral like with like the Pope stick or what have you. You're never going to do it.
Trying to smoke them out with incense.
Yeah, it's a waste of time. It's just going to fall apart. It's never going to work.
Yeah, why are you trying to replicate the university, fundamentally like bourgeois and anti-fascist sort of institution, right? And you end up with like, I think it's interesting what the kind of line on these conflicts is and how they're going to be resolved. I say interesting, like it's not also terrifying, right? Like as to whether who is the Italian futurist in this scenario, right?
Yeah, who's the futurist and who's Mussolini, right? I think probably, but I think we know actually. I think it is Yarvin who is himself the futurist. He's the one who's like imagining different kinds of states because he's a computer programmer who loves corporate power. And so when he comes up with his idea of how to solve the problems of liberal democracy, a system beset by problems because mostly because of the first word rather than the second, right? But he comes up with the ways to solve those problems that are like, okay, well, we need to smash apart the administrative state until it's small enough that like Peter Thiel or someone like him is able to be king of a bunch of it, right? And when I talked earlier about like, that's not what they're likely to actually do, right? Because that's so many steps removed. They like a big state. They want the state to be to do stuff for them.
Well, it's the sort of like the pendulum of like federal law enforcement and the rights conception, right? It bounces back and forth between like Ruby Ridge and like having your enemies arrested.
But Yarvin talks in these sort of very fantastic, almost like artful terms. He also is very keen to cite all of his high-minded sources. He's like, oh well, Bethus says in the Constellation of whatever, right? Whereas Rufo's like, what are you talking about with your like theorizing about like patchwork government? I went in and stole a university, I think that ultimately it's like, Yarvinism is going to end up being the like Yarvin's the Marinetti.
They're going to airbrush him out of all the photos. Yeah. He's you know what he is, like if you transpose this into Maoism, he's a right deviationist.
What I think is really interesting about this is what Yarvin wants essentially is the Holy Roman Empire, in the sense that he wants a patchwork of different kinds of states that make it really hard for an overarching government to dominate them. Now, who benefits in a situation like that? It's the holders of local and regional power and anybody who builds institutions that link them that are not state institutions. So the Holy Roman Empire is really, really hard to explain as a thing because it was these overlapping networks of different things. But what you can say is who it's good for, and who it's good for are elite groups who have access to broad interlinked networks that cross an enormous geographic and economic space, but who are not bound by higher laws, right? You can do what the fuck you want to do. If you're a rich burgher of Nuremberg, you can bring lawsuits against the emperor. That's fine. You
Imagine
can do
a
that.
rich burger.
Yeah. if you're a minor lord, your rights and privileges in your small corner of the world are really well protected. It's a system that's full of checks and balances that protect the authority of people who think they ought to be in charge. And I think that's what, if you're trying to point to what an idealized society looks like for this kind of theorist, that's it. It's one where the people who are supposed to be in charge and who are supposed to wield power over others are allowed to do so without interference from people they don't think ought to be able to do that.
They want American Charlemagne.
Well, the tension, I guess, becomes then, do you do that by fighting the administrative state, or do you do it by populating the administrative state? And I'll tell you, it's going to be a lot easier for them to just populate the administrative state. They almost don't need, going back to like, they barely need a Red Caesar. They barely need a Sulla. What they really just need is all of their party political people loyal in all of those institutions, and they eliminate then the term limits for them, and there you go.
Which is well advanced, as we know. So
that project is well advanced, and it's like this way of selling it, like the J.D. Vance way of selling it, is weird and off-putting, but even if it doesn't work, that goal stays the same. Peter Thiel's interest stays the same. Peter Thiel stays able to try and advance, essentially, as you say, November, American Hitler project again and again and again and again. And he doesn't have to succeed more than one time.
And even if he doesn't, quote unquote, succeed, he's still succeeding because even the act of interfering in these elections or exerting your influence in these elections is pulling things in the direction that you want them to. The fact that J.D. Vance is now a national political figure and is saying these things to audiences of people who are listening, whether all of them are agreeing with him or not, means that those ideas are now out there. They are part of the political discourse. It's like the idea of the Overton window, right, is actually useful for this, because things that were once completely beyond the pale, like explicit anti-democracy, is now back in American mainstream political conversation in a way that it hasn't been since, I don't know, Jesus, the late 19th century, the early 20th century.
Yeah, like Lindbergh at the latest, maybe?
Yeah.
That brings us, I think, all the way back round to what we mentioned at the very beginning with opinion forming, and then the right wing, the explicit, like stated party right wing, going off into the wilderness and then coming back to like steppe nomads, come back into the settled cities of popular opinion and then take them over and change it. Because like you can see what is now allowed to be decent opinion, quote, heavily air quotes around that, in the UK and the US. We've seen it be influenced by like the right going off, reforming itself, coming back and just stating the new terms of discussion before.
Yeah, and that kind of ability that they have to like hack liberal brains, right? To be like, the serious grown-up politics is when we compromise and when I kind of like admit the thought into my mind, right?
Yeah, we're going to compromise on Hitler. We're going to have a Hurtler. Woke Hitler.
But for a certain kind of lib, and especially one who's literate enough to, let's say, run the op-ed department at a newspaper, if you can reference Janissaries and Caesar, then you're speaking the correct language to have your ideas heard more broadly. If you could, so the esoteric stuff, which is mostly a turnoff for the vast majority of people, and for anybody who knows enough to understand what these are references to, is perfectly suited to kind of a half smart op-ed person that you're pitching op-eds to. That's perfectly it works great for that as a rhetorical strategy.
So I think that brings it back round nicely towards the beginning, where I think in summary we can say the American Caesar talk. Well, it's interesting to talk about who are they really talking about? Who do they mean? What kind of problems were they solving? What kind of problems do they think they were solving? Really, it's more about the echoes are with 19. It's, as you say, November, right? Your first instincts when you're thinking about this kind of stuff, it's often true without trying to follow their train of logic. Instead, just be like, no, they're just doing what the Nazis did, which is compare themselves to late Republican Rome.
Yeah, if
that's all that's
if it
happening.
steps like a goose, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So the American Caesar really is just what American Hitler would have said if he was trying to make the same case.
Mhm.
Well, we can do the 1950s in reverse. Finally, America can send some Nazis back to Germany. That's exciting. We need someone to teach us how to make burgers, but we don't have any. I suppose some of these distasteful American Nazis.
Anyway, I think that's brought it back to a nice circular place. So,
Chilling portent of things to come.
Oh yeah.
We accidentally talked about this on our comedy show.
Yeah.
So let's make the next one nice and light. What do we say?
The last line of defense at a sort of federal level is one former prosecutor. Great.
I mean, I thought we'd mostly be talking about like Diet Mountain Dew and comparing it to the full fat Mountain Dew you get in Europe, where the sugar content actually isn't that dissimilar. So most of my talking points were about that, and I'm sorry I didn't get to use them.
Genuinely, you're kind of right in that if there is hope to be found here, it's that many people find this weird and alienating and would prefer that we just keep on with the kind of patrician stuff.
Yeah. It's really weird watching this because like there's an extent to watching this from a place where there is an audience for the underlying ideas, right? Like there are plenty of kind of normal looking suburbanites who are perfectly fine with the idea of hurting people that they don't that they find distasteful. Like that is a perfectly acceptable thing in the social circles that that surround me.
You can put a number on it even. Like it splits about however your like county or whatever voted for Trump versus Biden, right?
Yeah, fairly closely. Yeah, I mean, but I think that there are a lot of people, I think especially women, to whom this stuff is extremely off-putting. Like there are a lot of well-educated suburban women with kids who are not like who have some conservative impulses, but who are deeply turned off by the idea of being mean and nasty and the idea that people should know their place, in large part because they know their husbands and they think their husbands are dumbasses, right? Like they're like to be really and truly like they're the smart ones in the relationship, and the idea that like their husbands are better than them is fucking nonsense, and they know it. And so like that is a swing, that is a block that exists throughout the suburban United States where you can be like, look, that guy sounds just like your husband. You think your husband's an idiot. You know he's an idiot. Like you want that guy to be in charge. Like that's a viable campaign strategy. To be completely honest with
FAO campaign headquarters, Kamala Harris.
I think there is something to be said, and I'll make this point really quick because like Patrick kind of really sort of nailed it, which is like, even if this very weird political project kind of fails, be it in November or even just like in the sort of past, you know, in the next few months, the sort of underlying sentiment, which I see it in the UK as well, especially like in light of like recent news stories and everything, where there not only seems to be like a much greater tolerance for sort of just really random acts of violence, but also like you can see there is like this kind of political energy to it as well, even the way in which like right-wing political parties like react to that. And so I do wonder whether it's like, okay, well, electorally speaking, voters might be turned off by like the weird stuff that Vance says and Trump tries to kind of, I don't know how it's going to work out, but like maybe it'll be that like they lose because of that, because Vance just can't stop being weird. But like that underlying sentiment is still going to be there, and it only requires like the right set of circumstances to really leverage more acts of spontaneous violence in a way that kind of serves the sort of Tealites who believe these very weird things very convincingly, but may never sort of run for public office because they know that they're weird.
I think like violence is a turnoff for a huge portion of the American electorate. Open racism is a huge turnoff for a huge portion of the American electorate. And I think that eventually these kind of right-wing freaks will find the right standard bearer and the right set of circumstances, but I'm not convinced that this is it. Like I think Vance is too weird. Trump is Trump. And there is just a hard ceiling at this specific point in time on how much support these people can get because the cons to them are so overwhelmingly obvious.
It's why they've done so well with the Supreme Court, right? Because they're completely unaccountable and sequestered.
And they were all weird anyway.
Well, true. And also, when you think about it, like the institutions of American like liberal democracy, such as it is, survived a Trump presidency, which sounded apocalyptic. And
I didn't think they would.
No,
I was
me
wrong
either.
about that.
You know what? I, along with Donald Trump, underestimated Mark Milley and Gina Haspel. And those are the last people on earth I want to be handing it to.
Yeah. Well, I guess it comes back to questions really not of who does what or who's meritorious, but ultimately how strong are your institutions?
Yeah, and how strong are the instincts of the people manning those institutions, right? Like when, after January 6th, when Mark Milley was sort of like, I think a lot about the thing he said to the like troops and the cops who are going to be like guarding the Biden inauguration, where he said that, you know, the Nazis aren't coming in, right? Someone who is in that position, who is able to make the instinctive leap that like, oh, these people are Nazis and this is the way you should think of them and therefore like treat them accordingly. That's useful. That's sort of that's healthy. And I think that's, if there's a lesson you can take from this, is that like that's a sort of useful instinct to like inculcate in yourself, whether you are chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or podcast listener, right?
Yeah,
The more
or both.
If you're listening. anyway, look.
I'm sorry people keep drawing you as like gay and trans.
Be more like Mark Milley. That's the lesson.
In some ways, yeah.
In that one very
narrowly defined. Yeah.
Not the haircut.
Yeah.
No, not the haircut, not the like history of service with the special forces in South America. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, not those things.
Yeah. Hey, don't let the Nazis in here. We're supposed to let them into other state capitol buildings. Not ours.
If you go to Argentina, you see a Nazi, you leave them alone. Here in the United States,
Anyway.
at least in this very specific context.
This colonial violence will not return to the metropole on my watch.
That's right.
I think that's all we got time for today. But Patrick, I always love having you on the show. I like having these conversations a great deal. So thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it. Talking to you guys is just my favorite thing in the world.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, and we, of course, have a Patreon. There is a bonus episode. I believe on this week, we will be talking in detail about what happened at CrowdStrike and also maybe some funny news stories in a startup or something like that.
More Diet Mountain Dew content.
Yeah,
please.
that's right. That's
right.
it.
And you can also check out Tides of History, of course.
Of course, absolutely. Anywhere fine podcasts are downloaded. Milo's got his Edinburgh show.
Yeah.
Edinburgh show, please check that out. And my special voicemail, which is on YouTube now.
And then November is going to be down with Kill James Bond
That's
by the
right.
time this is out.
August 9th, 10th, and 11th in London. You can still buy tickets, killjamesbond.com/live.
Yes.
That's right. And Mark Milley is organizing the security, so don't even try anything.
Yeah. All right. I think that's everything. We will see you all later, everybody. Bye.
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 Bye.